The fluorescent lights in the prison library buzzed with the kind of persistence that made everyone forget they were hearing them. Morgan Freeman sat in a folding chair at the back of the room, watching 12 men in identical gray uniforms attempt something that most people took for granted, the simple act of pretending to be someone else for the purpose of finding something true. The Riverside Correctional Facility's theater workshop met every Tuesday evening in a space that served triple duty as library, computer lab, and meeting room. Folding tables had been pushed against the walls to create a makeshift performance area, and a piece of masking tape on the linoleum floor marked the boundaries of what, for 2 hours each week, became a stage. Morgan had come at the invitation of Sarah Martinez, the volunteer drama instructor who had been running this program for 3 years. She'd written to him 6 months earlier, not asking for money or celebrity endorsement, but simply sharing what she was seeing happen in this room. Men who had never spoken publicly about anything more personal than their work assignments were getting up in front of each other and attempting Shakespeare, Tennessee Williams, August Wilson. "I thought you might want to see what they're doing," she had written, "not because they're good, though some of them are getting there, but because they're trying to be honest in a place where honesty can be dangerous." Now, sitting in the back of the room on a Tuesday in October, Morgan was watching the kind of workshop he remembered from his own early days in community theater, except that every participant was serving time for something that had brought them to this place where freedom was measured in increments and trust was earned in small gestures. "All right, Marcus," Sarah called out. "You're up." Marcus Williams stood up from his chair in the front row, holding a folded piece of paper that he'd been studying for the past 10 minutes. 34 years old, serving 8 years for armed robbery, Marcus had been attending the workshop for 6 months and had never performed solo before tonight. He walked to the center of the makeshift stage with the kind of careful movements that suggested he was aware of being watched, not just by his fellow inmates, but by the famous visitor who had been introduced simply as Morgan, a friend of the program. "This is from Fences," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the small room. "Troy Maxon talking to his son." Morgan leaned forward slightly. August Wilson's Troy was a character he understood deeply, a man carrying the weight of dreams deferred and promises broken, speaking to a son who represented both hope and fear about the future. Marcus unfolded his paper, took a breath, and began. "You live in my house, sleep on my bedclothes, eat my food, put on my clothes, because you are my son. You are my flesh and blood. Not because I like you, because it's my duty to take care of you." The words came out technically correct, delivered with the kind of careful enunciation that suggested Marcus had memorized not just the text, but a specific way of saying it. But something was missing. The rhythm was right, the meaning was clear, but the truth underneath the words, Troy's complicated love and frustrated anger, wasn't reaching the surface. Marcus continued through the monologue, his delivery steady and professional, hitting every word with the kind of precision that demonstrated he'd done his homework. But Morgan could see the disconnect between the actor and the character, between the words being spoken and the man speaking them. When Marcus finished, the room applauded politely. His fellow participants nodded encouragement, and Sarah offered the kind of supportive feedback that kept people willing to take risks in front of each other. "Good work, Marcus. You knew the text cold and your projection was strong. How did it feel?" "Felt all right," Marcus replied, but Morgan could hear the dissatisfaction in his voice. The performance had been competent, but not alive, and Marcus knew the difference. Sarah was about to move on to the next participant when Morgan stood up. "Marcus," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" The room went still. Everyone knew who Morgan was by now, though no one had made a big deal about his presence. He'd been introduced as a working actor who was interested in seeing what they were doing, and the men had accepted his presence with the kind of respectful distance that prison culture demanded. "Yes, sir." "Do you have children?" Marcus looked surprised by the question. "2 sons, aged 12 and 9. "When was the last time you saw them?" 3 years ago, before I came here." Morgan nodded slowly. "Troy Maxon is talking to his son about responsibility, about duty, about what it means to be a father when the world hasn't given you what you thought fatherhood would look like. You just performed that speech perfectly." but you performed it like someone who had studied Troy Maxon, not like someone who knows what it feels like to be a father who can't be with his sons. The room was completely quiet now. Marcus stood in the center of the makeshift stage, holding the folded paper, his expression shifting from polite attention to something more vulnerable. "I want you to try it again," Morgan said. "But this time, don't perform Troy's words. Just stand there and think about your own boys. Think about what you would say to them if they were here right now. If you could explain why you're here instead of there, why you made the choices you made, why being their father still matters even when you can't be with them." Marcus looked down at the paper in his hands, then back at Morgan. "Don't look at the script," Morgan added gently. "You know the words. Just think about your sons and let Troy's words carry what you need to say to them." Marcus set the paper down on the floor beside him. He stood quietly for a moment, his eyes closed, and Morgan could see him shifting internally from actor preparing to perform to father thinking about children he missed. When he began speaking again, everything had changed. "You live in my house, sleep on my bedclothes, eat my food, put on my clothes, because you are my son." The same words, but now they carried the weight of a man who knew exactly what it meant to have sons whose houses he couldn't provide, whose bedclothes he couldn't buy, whose food he couldn't put on the table. "You are my flesh and blood, not because I like you, because it's my duty to take care of you." Marcus's voice broke slightly on the word duty, and Morgan could see him struggling with Troy's meaning and his own reality, the duty he couldn't fulfill, the care he couldn't provide from behind these walls. As the monologue continued, Marcus disappeared into the words in a way that he hadn't before. Troy's frustration became his frustration. Troy's love became his love. Troy's desperate attempt to explain himself to his son became Marcus's attempt to explain himself to sons who were growing up without him. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Marcus stood in the center of the stage, tears on his face that he hadn't tried to hide, his whole body different from the man who had performed the same words 10 minutes earlier. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before anyone moved. Finally, a voice from the front row spoke up. "Damn, Marcus, I felt that." Then another. "That was real, man." The applause that followed was different from the polite acknowledgement Marcus had received after his first attempt. This was the sound of recognition, of men who understood what it meant to access something true in a place where truth was often too dangerous to share. Marcus wiped his eyes and looked at Morgan, who nodded once, not approval for a performance, but acknowledgement of something more important. "What was the difference?" Sarah asked, though Morgan could tell she already knew. "First time I was acting like Troy," Marcus said, his voice still thick with emotion. "Second time I was just being myself, using Troy's words." Morgan walked to the front of the room, his movement casual but purposeful. "That's the difference between performing and acting," he said, addressing the whole group now. "Performing is when you put on a character like a costume. Acting is when you find the part of yourself that understands what the character is going through, and you let that part of yourself speak through the character's words." He looked around the room at the 12 men, each carrying his own story, his own losses, his own understanding of what it meant to be separated from the life he'd planned to live. Every character you'll ever play is going through something that connects to something you've been through. Your job isn't to become someone else. It's to find the truth in your own experience that matches the truth in theirs. One of the other participants, an older man named Robert, raised his hand tentatively. "But what if what we've been through isn't? What if it's not good? What if it's the reason we're here?" Morgan considered the question carefully. "Then you use that too. Pain, mistakes, regret, these aren't disqualifications from playing a character truthfully. They're qualifications. Every honest character is carrying something difficult. Your job is to bring your understanding of difficulty to their story." He paused, looking at Marcus, who was still standing in the center of the room. Marcus just did something brave. He took his own experience as a father who can't be with his children and used it to understand Troy's experience as a father who's struggling to connect with his son. That's not easy to do, but it's what made the performance real. The session continued for another hour, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Each participant who performed after Marcus brought a different level of honesty to their work. Not because they were trying to impress Morgan, but because Marcus had demonstrated that the most powerful performances came not from perfect technique, but from genuine connection between the actor's life and the character's truth. When the workshop ended, the men filed out slowly, some stopping to shake Morgan's hand, others simply nodding their thanks. Marcus was the last to leave, and he approached Morgan with the kind of careful respect that suggested he understood the gift he'd been given. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for being willing to go there," Morgan replied. "That took courage." "It hurt," Marcus admitted. "Thinking about them, saying those words, it brought up a lot of stuff I usually try not to think about." "Good acting usually does," Morgan said. "The question is whether the hurt serves something larger than itself. Tonight, it served Troy's story. It served everyone in this room who got to see what honesty looks like on stage, and maybe, in some way, it served your sons too." Marcus looked confused by that last part. "When you get out," Morgan explained, "and you have the conversation with them that you've been practicing in your head for years, you'll know how to be honest about the hard things. Because you practiced that honesty tonight." Walking to the parking lot afterward, Sarah fell into step beside Morgan. "That was incredible," she said. "I've been working with Marcus for months trying to get him to connect with the material like that." "He was already connected," Morgan replied. "He just needed permission to use the connection he already had." "Is that what you do? Give people permission?" Morgan thought about that as they reached his car. "Sometimes. Most people already know more about human nature than they think they do. They just need help trusting what they know." He looked back at the prison building, where fluorescent lights illuminated the library windows behind security glass. Those men in there have seen more truth about consequences, about choices, about what happens when lives go wrong than most actors will ever see. That's not something to overcome when you're acting. That's something to use. Driving home through the city, Morgan reflected on what had happened in that small room. Marcus had transformed not because he'd learned better technique, but because he'd been invited to stop hiding from his own experience and start using it. In a place where men spent most of their time trying to forget who they were before they arrived, theater was offering them something different, the chance to remember who they were while pretending to be someone else, to use their hardest experiences as material for understanding rather than just carrying them as burdens. The instruction Morgan had given Marcus, to think about his own sons while speaking Troy's words, wasn't really about acting technique. It was about recognizing that the most powerful performances came from the intersection of text and truth, from the place where an actor's real life met a character's fictional journey and found common ground. Months later, Sarah would write to tell him that Marcus had continued developing as a performer, that he'd started helping other workshop participants find their own connections to the material they were working on, that the simple instruction to stop performing and start being honest had become a cornerstone of how the group approached every scene. But more than that, she wrote, the men had started approaching their lives differently too. The practice of finding truth within fiction was teaching them to find truth within themselves, to see their own stories not just as sequences of mistakes and consequences, but as sources of understanding that could serve something larger. Morgan kept that letter in his desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the most important acting lesson had nothing to do with projection or memorization or character analysis. Sometimes it was just about having the courage to stop hiding and start using whatever truth you'd been given, even when that truth was harder to carry than any costume you'd ever worn.